This week, in my tour of the National Park Service sites, the French are back. Much of the well-known history of the U.S. revolves around fighting it out with the British Empire for independence and fighting with the Empire of Spain and its offspring for land and pride reasons. We often forget that the French had aspirations on the American continent as well, and the Sainte-Geneviève community on the Missouri River and the Illinois-Missouri border just south of St. Louis is a reminder of the French ambitions. The Sainte-Geneviève National Historic Park preserves a riverside community that was part of the French voyageur fur trapping and trading network that would get tangled up in things like Beau Brommel's beaver fur hat madness and the pemmican wars driven by the Northwest Company versus the Hudson's Bay Company nonsense. Since St. Louis is well south of the pemmican jerky dividing line, see episodes 84 and 110, Sainte-Geneviève developed into a center of much more diverse interests than just furs. Founded as a French settlement in 1750, it started serious operations as a trading post and later village center a few years later. It existed more or less quietly until the Dawes Act and similar land grant proclamations made crossing the Missouri and homesteading a thing to do. As a result, Sainte-Geneviève found itself a bustling crossroads in the stampede to the west. While pushing out the original locals, members of the Osage and other federated tribes, it did play a role as a haven for African Americans looking for a place to settle and call home. It would later be an important center for both agricultural trade and providing building materials to larger towns and then cities up and down the river. If you're curious about alternate history and traditions of America and the life of communities that were well established in the 19th century but had different roots, Sainte-Geneviève is an interesting time capsule of a different vision some people had for North America and how it was influenced as 19th century America rolled up to its doorstep. Episode 127, Old World Cake, New World Cake. Hello and welcome to the History of American Food. This week I'll be looking at how cake baking looked in the first part of the 19th century and the forces that were to drastically change everything. This is the last period in which baking a cake is at least a 2-day operation. To find out how a cake that doesn't even have icing or layers could take that long, what the popular flavors were, and what was upending the cake world, pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. The first thing you need to know is when making cakes, be sure to wash your butter. Use the finest family flour and dry it well, and be sure to pound your own sugar. If you get that pre-powdered stuff, you never know what they're putting in there, and that could ruin your cake. Now, if you've been following along from the start, all of these statements make perfect sense. If not, well, what are you waiting for? Head to the back catalog and get in the know. But what's most interesting right now is there are more and more dairies. Rather than just people milking their own cows, you could now buy butter. In fact, the concept of butter and egg money were starting to emerge. And some of those butter stamps, those were the first recognized marketing in America. And so salting that butter thoroughly was really important to make a product that kept. So yeah, wash that butter for your cake. Sure, for things like sauces where you wanted something highly seasoned anyway, butter washery was not so important. But we all know that nobody wants an oversalted cake. Raise your hand if you ever swapped salt and sugar in an early baking catastrophe. And this also explains why a lot of early American cooking does not specify salt if butter was an ingredient. Anyway, sugar was still pretty special in the early 19th century, but it was no longer something rich people had special locked chests for keeping it in. At this point, sugar was becoming affordable and common enough that candy made of just sugar is very nearby. But right now, at the start of the 19th century, it is still purchased mostly as solid lumps and loaves, and for the best sugar, it was pounded to a powder in one's very own kitchen. But the biggest innovation hovering on the horizon was the end of yeast-risen cakes. These days, once you've chosen your recipe and possibly shopped for ingredients, from the time you say, "I'll make a cake," to cake is at most a few hours, and for most cakes, far, far less. I'm not counting frosting. Where we are in the early 19th century, cake recipes state that you need to first stir the butter, after it's washed, with a wooden spoon or your hand until it is soft as new cream. And many include the admonition that this could take anywhere from 30 minutes to 2 hours, depending on the quantity of butter and possibly the season of the year. This, incidentally, is where the instruction, "cream together the butter and sugar," comes from. These old cookbooks tell you to make your butter like cream and then add the sugar. Anyway, then it was time to determine if this was going to be a yeast-risen cake or an egg-risen cake. The oldest school style is yeast-risen, and you can see its modern versions all over the enriched dough sweetbreads like babkas and dachis and such of Central and Eastern Europe. And this meant at least an overnight rise, and possibly 2 rises depending on whether your tradition was add in all the enrichments at once or rise the dough like bread and then add the fat and the fruits and the flavorings and such and then rise it again. Regardless, cake was at minimum a 2-day process. That is, once you'd grown a batch of healthy yeast. For an egg-risen cake, one where all the puff comes from eggs, it meant a faster cake, but it was way more work. To get the rise meant whipping your eggs, the white and the yolk separately. And while whipping the yolk or yolks meant just getting it light and frothy, the whites had to be whipped for literally hours. At this point, egg whipping was still done with a knife or a bundle of twigs and occasionally a fork. I mean, wire whisks were invented in France and England in the 1830s. There are pamphlets advertising them in the 1840s, but they didn't really make their way over to America then, or really even for the rest of the century. Wire whisks were pretty much a novelty to most Americans in the 1960s, when Julia Child started using her whisk on TV. America, for whatever reason, largely skipped over whisks and went straight to the rotary egg beater. That's post-Civil War. So what I guess I'm really saying, along with not messing with laundresses, you did not want to arm wrestle a cook from the days before the egg beater. She had forearms that would make Popeye jealous. So whether your cakes were yeasty or eggy, they were still moist and pretty dense. On the plus side, they were likely to stay together wrapped in a napkin or in a saddlebag or in your pouch as a tasty morsel on the go. As with many other things we cover, the 19th century is where we see the split in Old World and New World baking traditions. America, on the move and with an increasing wheat supply, really starts to desire and consume baked wheat goods in quantity. Compared to places that developed long, slow-rise yeasted sweetbreads, the bready cakes that regularly added fruits to make them sweet, America, they leaned away from that and instead depended on sugar and molasses and, more sugar. But back in the old country, as Americans love to say, there was no chemical leavening on the horizon, and sugar was still pretty darn expensive. But as with America, the arrival of mechanical mills, wind, water, and even steam power were slowly making wheat flour cheaper for all there too. With revolutions sweeping the continent, the oldest feudal systems had been rattled and were changing shape a bit. And so in those regions where war wasn't too regular a visitor, they developed a range of yeast-raised cakes that would expand and spread and change. Now, one thing both places had in common, in Europe and America, cake was a pretty special food. It took time, it took sugar, and so it tended to only come out to mark special occasions and things like annual celebrations. An interesting twist is that many of the times marked with festivals happened when there wasn't a whole bunch of fresh food. Early spring and mid-winter particularly. Now, living in our robust food preservation and transportation system, we happily have little contact with a midwinter pantry consisting only of smoked meats, dried beans, and apples. The thrill of spring celebrations, where eating tansies or herb omelets and spring lamb is a bit damped down by year-round eggs and the fact that the freezer provides us with effectively fresh meat year-round. So, most bakers, they know that adding fresh fruit into a bread or a cake is kind of perilous because of all the extra water they release. But what most of us don't think about is that in many situations that call for cake, fresh fruit just simply wasn't around. And so when looking into the cakes that were based on enriched breads, you'll find that if they have fruit, and many of them do, it's dried or candied. I mean, really, making Christmas cake with fresh fruit seems silly and impossible if you think about it for a second. All of those bready cakes contained dried fruit, candied fruit, dried dates, dried figs, and spiced sugar mixtures, and of course, everybody's favorite shelf-stable food, nuts, or sometimes the poppy seeds and syrup mixture that is my absolute favorite goulash and hamantaschen filling. Oh, wait, what was I talking about? Right. Europe went on to develop lovely enriched cake breads that only now, a few hundred years later, are coming to the notice of the average American baker and cake consumer. And this is not to say there weren't cakes with fresh fruit. For example, the Bavarian Schweizgendatschi, I'll have a link to that in the show notes, has fresh plums pressed into the surface of enriched bread. And there's all sorts of these summer cakes, kolaks and datchis, that end up looking sort of like the cake version of those gorgeous vegetable focaccias everybody was putting up on the Insta. But then you look at American cakes of the same period and, well, they were taking a very different turn. The promise of a quick yeast, of a chemical yeast, of some sort of magical yeast powder was tantalizingly close. So let's talk chemical leavening. I admit, I've tossed around the term as if clearly you'd know what I'm talking about. All the way back in Amelia Simmons' late 18th century cookbook, there are recipes with pearl ash. And it is in American cooking that this item first appears as a cooking ingredient. Pearl ash and its antecedents as a substance have been known in non-cooking contexts for a very long time. Potash, the ashes from cooking fires leached with water to make lye, or as we know it now, extremely basic solutions of mostly potassium hydroxide, has been used in soap making, cloth dyeing, gefilte fish manufacture, leather tanning, gunpowder, and so on for a real long time. But in the age of understanding that chemicals are discrete, repeatable things made up of atoms, in other words, the 18th century, purifying chemicals and seeing what they could do was a popular pursuit of the moneyed class. Many did it or were patrons of odd, solitary, mostly men, who did such things on their dime or guinea or whatever. And so it was in the 18th century that pearl ash, as a baking ingredient, was first produced. And so it was near the end of the 18th century, pearl ash, as a baking ingredient, was first produced and then began to spread during the 19th. Okay, so even if you're not wondering, I'm going to tell you how to make pearl ash. The lye made from collecting the water that ashes have been soaking in, or the practice of leaching ashes, actually produces a soup of hydroxides and carbonates. These are all basic salts, and potassium is the most plentiful of the alkali metal ions present. All the salts represented in this sort of lye, potassium hydroxide, potassium carbonate, sodium hydroxide, sodium carbonate, and calcium hydroxide, along with a few other trace things, have the feature of different solubilities. This means they drop out of solution at very different concentrations and at different temperatures. And this is the same practical chemistry that allows sea salt harvesters, see episodes 9, 10, and 10.5, to get mostly sodium chloride out of seawater with just sunshine and some dikes. The same logic, but a different range of temperatures, would allow pretty pure potassium carbonate to be isolated by the rough and ready 18th century chemistry methods as well. And there was plenty of potash given all the wood-burning industries all over the 18th and 19th century. So a lot of that wood ash was industrially collected and leached. So once you had this leach water, it meant drying the potash solution and cooking off all the volatile organics, all the brown and burnable stuff. Then redissolving the crystals. First, anything that wouldn't dissolve in warm water was skimmed off and strained out. Then a long, slow simmer to concentrate the solution would commence. Potassium carbonate, the pearl ash chemical, is very hydrophilic. That means it hangs on to all the water it can for as long as it can. It will even yank it out of the air if given a chance. What this means practically is that all the other salts in the water will precipitate out or crystallize first in the kettle. Through some pouring off and straining, other of the salts could be purified out of the wood ash, and they were, especially the hydroxides for soap making. But once your aspiring practical chemist got down to a gooey solution that started to form this white scaly cap, it was mostly just potassium carbonate. And this last solution would be dried and sold as pearl ash, called that due to its bright white color, and that it tended to come out as little round balls. And because it was so hydrophilic, it would get this sort of wet shimmer from continually pulling water out of the air and trying to dissolve itself. The fact that potassium carbonate was the last to come out of solution is partly why it ended up as the first leavening, and not the sodium hydrogen carbonate or bicarb we use today. It was simply, at that time, the easiest to make. But you ask, why don't we still use pearl ash today? Mainly, because it has a very distinctive, bitter, sort of soapy, alkaline flavor. It's like if you take a taste of plain baking soda and multiply it by 10 plus a little soap. If you look in the oldest cookbooks where pearl ash was included, it's only used in a limited number of recipes. Things that were meant to accompany something else strongly flavored or were strongly flavored themselves. Gingerbread and plain soda cakes and pearl ash cakes that would be eaten with highly flavored sauce or jam were common, but delicately flavored sweet things like a lemon cake or a plum cake or a seed cake were not. Okay. So what I'm saying is that pearl ash wasn't an American-only thing, but it seems it was mainly used only in American baking. Why? Because America was the only place where lots of people were regularly on the road. If you look back in my earlier episodes, I point out that the average person around the world at this point was a complete homebody. Moving house to another village or a town or country was an event, no matter who you were, peasant or merchant or princess. And when most of these people traveled, they took as much of home as they could with them. Obviously, how much that was varied greatly by class. But cooking bread while traveling was simply not a thing that happened. It happened in nice sturdy homes and castles and religious houses with bakers not expected to go anywhere. But suddenly here, where everyone gets peripatetic, restless and all interested in setting up in a new place, the nice, sensible 2 to 4 day routines that resulted in cakes and breads and pies and muffins were just all thrown into chaos. And so there was interest in something that could be added to a dough or batter mixture and produce lift right away. Okay, sure, all that makes sense. But how did these mainly English bakers figure out to start messing with pearl ash as a baking ingredient in the first place? Well, let's look at that pioneer in making culinary history a real thing, Karen Hess. She speculated on this back in her annotated version of The Virginia Housewife by Mary Randolph that she first published in 1984. Adding hardwood ash to corn was a long-standing practice in the Americas for defending the dried corn against rodents, for the nixtamalization, and apparently as a way to provide some saltiness and perhaps some lift to baked corn cakes. In 1984, the research on this last item was spotty and particularly frustrating because it was hard to tell what sources were contaminated by later editions of information and which were genuine. And in the 1980s, the study of indigenous foodways of the Americas and, frankly, the world in general, was on its shaky baby legs. But the very fact that a habit of including wood ash and cal, the powdered lime of ex-New Spain, were already common practices in the corn cookery of the Americas before any Europeans showed up lends weight to the speculation that using chemical leavening in baked goods is an indigenous practice absorbed by colonists, the same way popcorn and hickory smoking hams was. The fact that chemical leavening was adopted so readily by American cooks speaks to the fact that they were on the move and that American women were really out there on the far end of society. They were so lacking in help and support of both related and unrelated women that they were ready to take up anything that made any part of their daily and weekly responsibilities easier. So if you're in a community with strong community ties and routines that support communal food prep in activities like baking, with a local brewer for yeast, a community oven for baking, plenty of people to help with the eternal chop wood, haul water, and wooden boxes and cool rooms to store bread so you can bake once a week, there's much less reason to turn to chemical leaveners. But if it's just you, making the soap, doing the laundry, dressing the birds, cracking the corn, tending the garden, feeding the cows, skimming the cream, churning the butter, drying the apples, birthing the babies, and chasing the children, and you live in a small cabin with nowhere to store bread for a week, and the mice always get to it, and you always have to make your own yeast, this instant rising agent, even if it does have a bit of a soapy taste, it's going to have a lot of appeal. And if there's anything that Americans have shown, it's that they aren't satisfied with the first version. The innovation in sawmills, grain mills, sugar making, shipbuilding, even canning jars meant that this chemical leavening that shortened the whole rigmarole around causing baked goods to rise and get fluffy meant that pearl ash was not going to stand alone for long. It would be improved upon, and soon. By the second half of the century, all manner of yeast powders and chemical yeasts, as they were called, will appear. But before this happens, let's look at what cakes were preferred by the early 19th century hostess, as we are coming to the end of the reign of Old World cake. Boiled puddings were certainly on their way out. But with just a bit more flour and access to iron ovens, these same mixtures were starting to appear as plum cakes. Happily, everyone already knew how to make the boozy sauce that went with it. And if you're craving a bite of this goodie, there are plenty of versions of the Lincolnshire plum cake to be found, which is a very good representation of 19th century plum cake. Modern recipes are fine for getting a taste. All it means is now you have a recipe that's much more usable than what Mary Randolph would tell you. I'll put a link in the show notes to a good yeasted Lincolnshire plum cake if you want to go real old school. Pound cake, extremely popular, especially if you skip the vanilla flavoring and instead use stuff like sweet wine, caraway, and lemon. Then you'll get a flavor that is very true to the style. If you want to really go for it, go ahead and whip up the yolks and whites separately. Mix the yolks in with the sugar and the whites in at the very end before popping it in the oven. It's not cheating if you use a mechanical or even electrical beater to help with the eggs. I mean, what? You're not baking it in a wood-burning oven, are you? And sure as shootin', those cooks would have climbed across you for that mixmaster. The risen, rolled, and filled bready cake that is king cake, eaten for Mardi Gras celebrations, is a perfect example of American old-school cake. This is a yeast-risen cake, but it was brought to its modern version in that hothouse of food evolution that is New Orleans. I mean, what? Don't tell them how to be modern. Cakes that use a mush of potato or ground rice in combination with the wheat flour are also excellent examples of 19th century cakes. Most people couldn't go out to the store to get extra ingredients if they were running out, and in most parts of America, something was often mixed with the wheat flour to stretch it. I mean, sure, sometimes nefariously, but often on purpose. Maria Rundle's Carolina rice cake is such an example in her new system of domestic cookery. But there were also purely American adaptations of the cake idea. some made of scalded or softened cornmeal, sweetened with molasses, and then made tender with pumpkin, along with the regular flour and eggs. These were versions of what many called Indian cakes. After all, Indian or Indian meal at this point was the word being used for cornmeal. And these cakes or pones or bannocks, choose your region, fall into the category of regular people food instead of rich people food. The most easily found recipes for this are in Lydia Marie Child's The Frugal Housewife cookbook, though in later editions she changed the name to the American Frugal Housewife. There was an English tome called The Frugal Housewife as well, and the importation of English cookery books was very common in the 19th century, and Child smartly desired to distinguish her American work. Mrs. Child's list of cakes is a bit limited, as she was quick to warn that the overindulgence in rich food and ingredients beyond one's practical means were wasteful and indicative of social striving that was destructive to good household economy. After all, she did include instructions for how to freshen up a loaf cake that was, quote, slightly injured by time or being kept in the cellar, unquote. She was also an abolitionist writer who constantly strove for broader opportunities for women to express themselves in society. She was not one of the women who hid her authorship of a book, even though public opinion at the time tended to frown upon women who sought such notoriety. One thing all these cakes have in common: all the rise comes from either yeast or eggs. None of them have chemical leavening. And another thing, not a single one has vanilla. While vanilla was entering the baking sphere in the early 19th century, it was mainly happening in Europe, where they were getting it from plantations outside of South America, established by the French and Spanish. Think like bourbon vanilla from Madagascar or Tahitian vanilla. And most vanilla was only being used by professional bakers. You could get vanilla pastry cream from a big city pastry baker, but it was not an ingredient available yet to home cooks. The one place the new chemical leavening was being used in the dessert realm was in gingerbread. This was an old-fashioned sweet that was getting transformed by its residency in the New World. The oldest gingerbread was made from grated breadcrumbs that were stuck together with honey and a range of warming spices, ginger obviously being the topmost. Over time, eggs and new flour were added along with that new sugar. So a baked gingerbread was developed. But this gingerbread biscuit or cake remained basically a thin, crisp cookie that was meant to show off access to a range of spices and sweeteners. In the 18th century, molasses or treacle was added, and some versions of the biscuit or cake would be a bit thicker or softer. But all of them looked something like what we would classify as a cookie. Enter the chemical leavening. The American gingerbread doesn't just get molasses and allspice from Jamaica added. It becomes bona fide cake. Soft gingerbread or gingerbread baked in cake pans happens. Some of these cakes still use just eggs or even sweet barm, that is yeast, to give them lift, but the ginger and usually molasses and nutmeg and allspice and sometimes cloves and sometimes caraway and sometimes rosewater and sometimes mace all added enough flavor to the mixture that the alkaline flavor of the pearl ash could be covered up. And all the American cookbooks up and down the social ladder had several gingerbread recipes. They ranged from stuff called literally plebeian gingerbread, which had the least spice and sugar, to things like sugar gingerbread, sugar and butter gingerbread, soft gingerbread, plain gingerbread, and, in their own words, many of another sort. So while pumpkin pie may be the first distinctly American pie, soft gingerbread cake with a chemical leavener alone or in addition to the puffing power of yeast or eggs is certainly the most distinctive early American cake. So if you want to try out a gingerbread cake, it's fine to use modern baking soda. The molasses provides the acid you need to activate it, or even just baking powder, or both. But to get the real thrill, use the freshest spices you can. Go buy just what you need from a place that sells bulk spices if an order from Penzeys is a little too much. Maybe even grind and grate your own cinnamon and nutmeg if you're feeling particularly industrious. But you need to get really fresh spices to get that hot kick that the 19th century gingerbread would have had. I'll link a recipe in the show notes that hits the right spirit. Since American food of the Northern Prairies is making a splash right now, feels like the perfect time to enter the world of 19th century jellies. The gelatin stuff, not the cousin of jam. Back in meat-poor Europe, jellied foods were almost exclusively the food of the rich. But with the American acres of cows and pigs, not to mention the cod operations on the New England coast, the materials for jellies were available to more people than ever before. I'll also spend a little time explaining the whole jam-jelly problem in America and how we got in that mess. So join me next episode for what sets the stage for the American Jell-O explosion in the 20th century. And while we're there, all the Americans can learn about a proper blancmange. Thanks for listening. Any email questions or quibbles will continue to reach me at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com. Downloading the episodes helps me know you are out there, but even better than that are your reviews. Let more people know that you're listening and enjoying the show, or at least find it interesting. I'm also doing a deep dive into the 19th century with a co-host, Jamie Lewis of Plague of Strength. Right now, we're following the new Amazon Prime series, The Legend of Zorro, to give us a look at New America from the perspective of Old Mexico. It's our much looser and rather wilder podcast, prize fighters, circus freaks, and gangsters. It still includes food, but now with fashion. Lots of fashion right now, and fighting and fraud, and now with telenovela drama. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle, and you can find me on Threads and Insta at THOA Food, and more or less everywhere else on the internet if you look around. And all this information is available in the show description.